So we left off with the Battle of Gettysburg. It took place July 1st through 3rd, 1863. And remember the significance of the Battle of Gettysburg. It was a Union victory, and it was very significant because it is considered the biggest turning point of the war. It was the farthest north that the Confederate Army would ever reach before being turned around and would be retreating for the rest of the war. Um, but happening at the same time as the Battle of Gettysburg, concluding at the same time, was the Battle of Vicksburg, which was taking place down in Mississippi. We haven't really talked about battles that far south very much, but there definitely was fighting all through the deep south and over into Texas as well. This is going to be the most significant battle of this region that we're going to learn about. And Vicksburg was important because it was on the Mississippi River. And remember a while back, we learned about the Union strategy during the war. Remember, it was a three-part strategy called the Anaconda Plan. And the first part was to blockade all the ports so that the South could not ship out their cotton and they could not get in any of the resources that they would need. Part two was to capture the Mississippi River to also block trade as well as to split the Confederacy in half. And part three was to capture Richmond, the capital. Well, by 1863, pretty much all the ports, most of the ports in the South have been blockaded. The Union has been also conquering places along the Mississippi River. Remember, we've already covered how they captured New Orleans. Admiral David Farragut helped capture New Orleans, which was not only a port, but also the mouth of the Mississippi River. And they've been capturing places all along the Mississippi River, and the last holdout was Vicksburg, the last place they hadn't conquered yet. So the goal by capturing Vicksburg would be to control the entire Mississippi River. All right, so this battle, it's not really like a traditional battle like we think of happening on a battlefield. Kind of like that, although there was fighting and stuff that occurred as well. But the tactic that was used with the Battle of Vicksburg is something called a siege, S-I-E-G-E. It's on the screen there. So the person who is leading the Union Army here to carry this out is Ulysses Grant. And what a siege is basically using your army to completely surround a town and block off everything going in and out of the town. So it's kind of like a blockade, but it's on land around a city. And the idea is to block any kind of resources from getting into the city. And that mostly means things like food and medical supplies, so that the people really are forced into a surrender because they're starving. And that's essentially what happens with Vicksburg. The conditions in this town deteriorated over the course of these couple of months between April, May, June, July of 1863, that the food supply just ran completely out and people were literally starving. Many of them resorted to eating things like rats or dogs or anything that they could find because there was just no food. And as I move to this next slide, it kind of talks about that. This top quote up here, it's somebody who is sort of trying to make light of it because, sometimes when things are at their worst, you try to make light of it, try to have some fun with it, I guess, to the best that you can. But this person wrote a fictitious menu advertising their local delicacies in Vicksburg, such as mule head stuffed a la mode and mule tongue cold a la bray. And so that's basically just they're eating the head of a mule or the tongue of a mule, than just making it sound fancy by adding those other words. And so that's just how bad things were there. As this next quote says, "What is to become of all the living things in this place when the boats come in shelling? God only knows, shut up as in a trap, no ingress or egress," that means coming or going, "and thousands of women and children." So the outcome, Vicksburg did eventually surrender, and the North did win that battle. And the significance of it was that they now have control of the entire Mississippi River. So July 3rd, 1863, the Confederates lost the Battle of Gettysburg and the Battle of Vicksburg. So not only did they get turned around in Gettysburg and would be on the retreat for the remainder of the war, but they've lost the entire Mississippi River. So that was just a huge moment in the war, were those two battles taking place. So as we move to our last event of 1863, it took place in November. This is not a battle. But in November of 1863, there is a service being held in Gettysburg. So this is now from July to September to November. I guess that's what, like 5 months. This is about 5 months after the Battle of Gettysburg, and there's a ceremony being held to basically dedicate the battlefield, kind of like a memorial service. So they're coming together to sort of bless the ground and to dedicate the field. So President Lincoln was invited to speak at this ceremony. He wasn't even the primary speaker there, the only speaker there, but he got up and gave a speech that was one of the shortest presidential addresses in history. It's literally only like 2 minutes long. Imagine any president getting up to give us a major speech and it only being 2 minutes. But he said more in those 2 minutes than a lot of presidents say in an hour. But it's gone down in history as one of the greatest speeches of American history. So it's called the Gettysburg Address. So it was given by Abraham Lincoln for the purpose of dedicating the battlefield at Gettysburg. And so the address starts off with pretty familiar words to a lot of people. 7 years ago. You've probably heard that. Don't know if you know what it means. A score is 20 years. So 4 score, got to do a little math here, would be 4 times 20, that's 80. But it says 7 years ago. So 80 plus 7, that's 87 years ago. So keep in mind this speech is being given in 1863. And if you subtract 87 years, you can pause and do that if you want, or I'll give you the answer. So 87 years prior would have been 1776. Hopefully you remember what significant thing happened in 1776. Signing of our Declaration of Independence. So what Lincoln says here is 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. So time out. What he has said so far is that back in 1776, the founders of our nation wrote this document that formed our country around the idea that all men are created equal and that they are blessed with liberty and freedom. And he's saying now we are in a civil war to test whether that country with those values and those principles can continue. Is it going to remain? Can it long endure, as it says? So he says that we've come to dedicate the field so that there could be a final resting place for the people who died. But then he goes on, so time in. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men living and dead who struggled here have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. So time out. He's saying that we can't really dedicate this field because the men who died on this field have already dedicated. They've already done more than we ever could do as living people later after the fact, that they have already paid the ultimate price. So there's nothing more that we can do to make this field, dedicated to them because they've already paid that ultimate price. So he goes on to say, the world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. He says the world will little note or remember what we say here. What that means is he's like, well, people won't remember what words we use here, which I think is kind of ironic because this speech has been memorized by people for, a century and a half since he gave it. I know when I was in 8th grade, I had to memorize it and recite it to the class. That was an assignment I had. And many people have studied this address and memorized this address. So people really do remember what he said there. But what his point is he's saying that we need to, as the living, we need to dedicate ourselves to the work that those men were fighting for. They gave their lives. So how can we dedicate our lives to that same cause? So he says, it is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead, we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion. That we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. So what he's saying is that it's our job to continue fighting for what they gave their last full measure of devotion. That means they gave their final everything they could, which is their life. That we need to dedicate ourselves so that they didn't give their lives in vain. They didn't die for no reason. That we will continue the fight, that this nation will have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people will continue and will not perish from the earth. So he's calling on people to continue the fight, to dedicate their lives to continuing to ensure that we are a nation of freedom and of liberty, and that we continue a government that is of, by, and for the people. You've probably heard that phrase before, and this is where it came from, of the people, by the people, and for the people. So I really just think this speech is a beautiful speech, and the message of it is not just a message for November of 1863. It's a message that I think we can still learn from and still take away that message today, that we should always be fighting for, our country to represent its ideals, freedom and liberty and equality for all. So that is concluding 1863. So we'll pick up with 1864 in our next video.